to start with some disclosures. My main conflict of interest is that I'm studying biases. Therefore, it is very likely that I'm heavily biased. Don't take what I say for granted. I published a paper that says that why most published research findings are false. That applies also to my research. I will share some lessons that I have learned, or I have tried to learn over the years on reproducibility. And I have to say that many of the fields that I have tried to touch empirically, initially I knew next to nothing about them, but I found very eager colleagues who introduced me to their methods and their practices. And still I think I know next to nothing. Some preemptive comments. Science is the best thing that can happen to us. It's wonderful. Most scientific research, however, done today has been non-reproducible and has used suboptimal research practices. I think the fact that you're here today means that probably you suspect that this may be the case. Science is becoming more massive and more complex. Scientific publications, we have about 200 million of them. They are increasing at a rate of more than 7 million per year. They're mostly advertisements. And trust me that this research was done. We have a PDF. We don't really have, most of the time, the raw data. We don't have the experimental material, the algorithms, the codes that would resurrect that research and make it alive again. Reward systems in academia and science in general are aligned with non-reproducible and suboptimal research practices. At the same time, the last decade has seen a flurry of interest and multiple efforts to address problems of reproducibility and to improve our research practices. The question, though, is, are we doing better? And also, can we do better? Here's a map of science that I have created with my colleague, Kevin Boyek. It has about 500,000 scientific subdisciplines. Science is not one thing, it is many different fields, subfields, subdisciplines. The research practices in each one of these subdisciplines that also evolve over time phylogenetically. Some of them split into more than one, others get merged, some shrink, others expand. The research practices vary substantially. And there's also infiltration of the research practices of some fields to other fields. So it's not a steady state, it's an evolving, very dynamic continuum. What makes things even more complex is that the published literature, that universe that you see in that map, is only part of the larger universe that probably most of it is dark matter. You see lots of colors here, which is published papers, published work. But there's a lot of unpublished dark matter, and I'm not paranoid to say this. We have seen in many fields that a large share of the work being produced remains unpublished. We know currently that with AI there may be zillions of analyses being done and zillions of things being produced, but very often there may be no even interest to share them in the published record. So I don't know if the dark matter is at least as big or perhaps much, much bigger than the color that you see. Another confounding factor is a Simpson's paradox, for those who are familiar with Simpson's paradox from meta-analysis. What does it mean? Even if single fields improve over time, the total universe may get worse if the dark matter increases and or if the the least reproducible fields grow at a faster pace. So fields that are least reproducible, least reliable, they don't care that much, they just want to publish papers, they just publish millions of papers. If they grow faster than the fields that are rigorous, then even if all fields make some progress relative to their own baseline, we will see things getting worse. Some common features apply, though, to most fields. One of them is statistical significance. Any of you has published a paper that has p-values and none of the p-values are statistically significant? One? Congratulations. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Another one, very timid. What a great mistake. You should correct that immediately. That paper should be retracted. Non-significant. Well, significance has become a boring nuisance. 96% of the biomedical literature claims statistically significant results. We've seen that in text mining of the entire PubMed and also the PubMed Open Access. We have repeated that exercise more recently, and we see some interesting trend. We see some degrees in statistical significance, which is really nice, but I'll show you what I mean. Not just biomedicine, but across every single scientific field, we have pretty strong evidence, the footprint of publication selection bias. We can look at that through meta-analysis, and we've examined meta-analysis in medicine, environmental sciences, in psychology, in economics. This is some work that Francis Ricardo led, and we published recently, looking at about 70,000 meta-analysis. The vast majority of them from medicine. Actually, I was happy to see that medicine seemed to be doing better compared to other fields, although there's selection bias also in what meta-analysis were included. In our sample, medicine was very comprehensive. We included everything, both primary outcomes and others that people may not be so interested to get significant results, where other fields were more definitively interested in getting significant results. Most likely, most of the significant results should not have been significant. And you can look at that in different ways with empirical validation and modeling, or combinations of both. This is another paper that Stefan Bruns led from our collaboration, estimating the extent of selective reporting in economics. We tried different assumptions across the economics literature. Most of that assumptions suggest that most of the economics literature is false positives. Some of them lead up to rates of 7% or even 8% of the economics literature being false positives. And some others are down to 50% or even 45%, but not better than that. Along with Ben Moll, we looked at statistical significance in the field of reproductive medicine. And interestingly, we saw a lot of statistical significance, but also a trend for some decline in some areas. For example, clinical trials do not always have statistically significant results, which may be a bit reassuring. Of course, it depends on what kind of clinical trials we're talking about. Some phases and some types of trials may be more likely to have significant results than others. Could there be an inverse bias? For example, what I call inverse publication reporting bias in favor of no results. In some fields, we might see that. This is an analysis summary that I published recently looking at the extent of that phenomenon. And there are areas where maybe the incentive is inversed and people want to publish non-significant null results. For example, studies of toxicity or harms of intervention. The incentive, especially in the presence of financial conflicts, would be to show that, well, this biologic, this vaccine, this new drug is not harmful. There's no problem, there's nothing here. Move away from my money. I just want to sell that product and everything is fine. Or non-inferiority studies. A lot of regulatory agencies are happy to see non-inferiority. Again, most of those would be non-statistically significant results. Or perhaps in our own world, reproducibility checks. We have an incentive to show that we proved you wrong and your significant results were not supposed to be so. So that there may be an incentive even in people who really want to improve science and have the best motives. How much fraud and how much sloppy science do we have? And are their rates increasing? That's the $1 billion, or probably more than $1 billion, because the research funding worldwide is several hundreds of billions of dollars actually every year. And we don't really know. But we can model the scientific ecosystem. And here's one such model that, along with David Grimes, we have created. We use 11 equations that characterize and build an artificial, I would say in vitro, in silico universe of science. It includes three types of scientists. The diligent scientists who do rigorous work, the careless scientists who do sloppy work, and the fraudulent scientists who just produce fake papers. We all hope that the diligent scientists are the majority, and how many? Obviously, it's not so easy to admit fraud. In the past, many surveys had suggested that maybe we have 1% of scientists that are fraudulent. That's what I thought. This is what I have stated in multiple keynotes and talks. Probably have been very wrong about that, and I will show you why. I think that the rate is probably much higher at the moment. So we run that model, that in silico model universe of science, through a number of cycles of what you do, you get rewarded. And you get rewarded by getting more funding to do more of the same. And you also generate progeny of younger scientists who also have the same features, the same characteristics as you do. By running a number of cycles, we see that the diligent scientists decrease, and the careless scientists increase, and the fraudulent scientists eventually dominate the system. There's no need of 11 differential equations to understand that. If we run that model and everyone gets the same reward for producing, let's say, a unit publication of some impact, someone who can cut corner has an evolutionary advantage. They can get there with less work, with less effort. Someone who can get there doing nothing, just producing fake papers with AI or with whatever other means, has a tremendous evolutionary advantage, unless we find ways to reward those who are diligent and or to penalize those who are careless and slow. How do we do that? There's many opportunities for building science at the moment, and there's new ways of building CVs and building scientific work. We have mega journals, and these are defined here in that paper that we published in JAMA as journals that publish more than 2,000 articles every year. They're not predatory journals. Some of them might be predatory journals, but in principle they don't have to be predatory journals. Their acceptance rates are 25 to 60%. It's not 100% like in predatory journals. They claim to have more rapid review. I'm not sure that there's good evidence for that. I'm not sure there's good evidence about the quality of the peer review, which really is horrible on average in any type of journal anyhow. They charge modest to large article processing fees. This is their business model, but other journals also do the same most of the time. In some fields, mega journals have completely changed what the literature looks like. So my alma mater field is epidemiology. So the journals that I grew up as being the ones that are trustworthy about epidemiology and have epidemiology in their title: American Journal of Epidemiology, Journal of Clinical Epidemiology, European Journal of Epidemiology, International Journal of Epidemiology, they publish about 100 to 200 papers every year. Now there's journals in my field that publish 7,000 papers in a single year. Another one published 18,000 papers in the previous year. Then it lost its impact factor. We'll see how many it publishes now. But I think that this is a completely new, brave world that when I think of epidemiology and when I think about many other fields, I have to consider a much wider spectrum of publications. Predatory journals, how many are they? Are they growing? Are they decreasing? Are they about the same? We don't really know. There's not even a fully agreed definition on what is a predatory journal, although if you see one, I think you recognize one. There's no consensus and no, I think, agreement on how to go towards identifying and claiming that this is definitely a predatory journal and reaching some consensus in the scientific community that somehow we should ban or exclude or leave these journals out. Paper mills. We know that paper mills are becoming more busy. Well, we suspect that. There is work that suggests that there's a lot of papers that are created by paper mills. A large number of retractions seem to come from paper mill products at the moment. We believe that this is just the tip of the iceberg. Probably there's far more. How would we know? Well, maybe AI could help us to understand how much more. There are tools that can probe to see whether AI has been involved in generation of a fake paper. So AI trying to understand, probe AI. And we have preliminary evidence. For example, Wiley announced pretty recently that 1 in 7 submissions to hundreds of their journals, I think about 270 journals that they published had used that screening tool, were flagged by that tool as being paper mill products. Now, if we think of 7 million papers published, and 1 out of 7, that would be 1 million. That's way out of range compared to what we're used to, like 1 out of 1,000 papers being retracted traditionally. And of course, the rate is growing, but nowhere close to 1 million papers just being AI fake paper mill products. John Carlyle, an editor of Anesthesia, which is a very prestigious journal in anesthesiology, one of the journals that carry the highest impact factor and very well respected, for a number of years has been asking authors of clinical trials that are submitted to his journal to share their own data as a precondition for review and publication. Roughly 30 to 40% of the clinical trials that are submitted to that prestigious journal, and clinical trials, I want to remind you, are probably the most disciplined, the most protocolized, the most pre-registered, the most transparent compared to many, many other fields. 30 to 40% of these trials, he thought the data sets were so improbable, so implausible, that they were either completely messed up or completely fraudulent. He coined the term zombie randomized trial, and to celebrate his work, I wrote that editorial, which was very appropriately published on a Halloween day, and I calculated that if his experience applies to other journals, which on average are not as prestigious and as careful as Anesthesia, then about 500,000 randomized trials are already circulating among us. Scientists are very smart people, so I think that it's expected that the scientific workforce will be attracted by what is hot, what seems to be important, what gets incentivized. This is a paper that we published in PNAS where we looked at what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and 2021. 98 of the 100 most cited papers across all science were on COVID-19. Typically, hot fields that dominate science may publish 2 or 3, maybe 4 out of 100 top cited papers across all science. COVID-19 absorbed 98 out of 100. We studied the growth of the COVID literature, currently more than 1 million papers worth of publications, about 2 million scientists publishing on COVID-19. If we divide science in 174 fields, according to the Science Metrics classification, experts from each one of these 174 fields moved into publishing COVID-19 related work. The last field to fall to COVID-19 was automobile engineering in the fall of 2020. And it was not about how to build automobiles that enhance social distancing, some people being in the trunk and others hanging out. It was epidemiology, automobile engineers publishing epidemiology. What would you expect? The quality of the science suffered. We had some great successes. We managed to develop vaccines very quickly. We had some wonderful adaptive randomized trials showing that some few interventions are effective and most are not effective. But the average paper out of that million paper productivity was very, very low quality. Do we need revolution, or simply evolution would do to change that landscape? I have published papers in the past like this manifesto with great colleagues where we argue for revolutionary approaches. I have to say that I would be happy with stepwise evolution at this point. And I have also become worried, maybe I'm just becoming older, of revolution that has no evidence to support it. I have also started ruminating, perhaps again because I'm getting older, whether we should focus more on identifying problems or just push for solutions. I hear a lot about pushing for solutions, and I feel that very often we lack the evidence, or we lack even the understanding of some basic features of the scientific universe, like how big is the dark matter? How much bias of this or that sort do we have? Where do our incentive systems fail to be able to apply solutions that would really make things better? We all talk about reproducibility, and this is a text mining exercise showing the rise of the use of that terminology across the scientific literature, across all scientific fields. However, reproducibility means very different things. It could be reproducibility of methods, meaning, can I understand the methods of some scientific work and make them work again in a different environment, in my lab, in my laptop, in another team? Reproducibility of results, Can I get another study that shows some results that look like the ones that I obtained originally? And reproducibility of inferences, which is how I agreed with other people on what the evidence means when I look at these results from multiple studies. None of these types of reproducibility should be taken for granted. And the question that we should ask is, what is the optimum level that we should aim for? 100%, I think, is implausible to ever achieve. Would we be happy in specific fields with 90%, with 70%, perhaps with 60%? In some fields, perhaps even with 2% if the field mostly produces non-reproducible, non-reliable results. So, reproducibility of methods, I think, can be improved in some fields, but not necessarily in those that produce many papers. Some of these fields may just need to be abandoned, or we may just need to take for granted that, nutritional epidemiology has published 5 million papers, it just gone berserk, and, forget about it. Just fine, let these people continue publishing, but, there's nothing coming out of it. Reproducibility of results, I think it remains unknown in how many or most fields where and how and when replication is attempted, and where it should be attempted. We cannot try to replicate everything because there's a lot of junk, but where and how and who and in what way should we attempt reproducibility. Finally, reproducibility of inferences, is it even possible and worthwhile to improve? Along with Howard Bachner, we wrote a short piece that was published pretty recently, and we argue that by its very nature, inferential reproducibility may be doomed to be modest or low in some cases. And maybe what makes sense is to have transparency on why different experts, different scientists read different evidence in different ways. What is the reason? Is it conflicts, financial, non-financial, or is it some genuine understanding that is different about the strengths and the weaknesses of the evidence? Most research that is done and published today is based on small data sets. This is a stereotype that I show here. I don't have one particular study in mind, but typically you have the devoted principal investigator who has very limited funds and is struggling to get more funds for the next funding cycle. It's a small team and needs to build a case that their work is important, so cherry-picking the best-looking results for that. Much of that is done post hoc. P-value less than 0.5 is enough. Anyone can get there for any analysis. No registration, no data sharing. Why give ammunition to my competitors? And no replication, because if I try to replicate and what I found or thought that I found does not replicate, then I'm back to square zero. That's not a good recipe, obviously, and it's something that we see in many fields, and it continues to be very dominant. For example, we have witnessed that in neuroscience, in fields that range from basic science to translational science to clinical neuroscience. The common denominator is very small studies, underpowered environment, average power of 20%, with realistic assumptions, maybe average power of 8%. So you expect tons of false negatives and tons of false positives, even if there's just a tiny amount of bias. Economics looks pretty much the same. Along with Tom Stanley and Kristen Kaliagos, we have looked at all meta-analysis published in economics. The common denominator is that most studies are pretty much as underpowered as neuroscience. In the last 10 years, we have another paradigm that is becoming also pretty common. Big data research practices. Extremely large sample size, which means overpowered environment. These data sets accrue while I'm sleeping. I wake up in the morning and the electronic health record database that I work with has grown overnight. I was sleeping and it kept growing. You all carry mobile phones. They track everything that you do. Apple knows everything about you more than you do about yourselves. That information keeps growing. Genomics, same thing. But in order to build a paper for Nature or Science, one needs to build a narrative. So again, the best looking results, the most coherent results need to be composed. Much of that is done post hoc. There's far more fancy statistics here, but most of them are very idiosyncratic. no registration for the vast majority of that research, and far more data sharing, because these data sometimes are very easy to share, but few people understand exactly what is being shared. Few people know how these data have been accrued, how they have been produced, what to make of them, and unless you realize that having female patients with prostate cancer, there must be something wrong here, you will be using these data sets just thinking that, wonderful, millions of observations in my hands. So big data can generate a lot of noise and a lot of error. But the worst part, I think, is not small data or big data. The worst is no data. Meaning situations where nothing is shared, where nothing is disclosed, where we don't know anything other than hearing there's great progress, there's great technology, there's great artificial intelligence, existential threat for humanity, but not open source. My first major example was when I wrote the first negative paper about Theranos. In 2014, I sent it to JAMA. It went through editorial, peer, and legal review because I claimed that maybe their evaluation should not be $9 billion, but just $9. Currently their evaluation is $0 and their CEO is in jail. They were very proud to operate in stealth mode. They were changing the world, changing healthcare, revolutionizing everything, but we're proud that we're not sharing anything. And of course, they had nothing to share. But Theranos is not just a single bad apple. We have looked along with Ioannidis and Eli Han across all unicorns in healthcare-related fields. About half of them have the same lack of evidence of data, of publications, as Theranos did. And I'm not saying that they're fraudulent, but we cannot even tell. AI. Much of the conference is about AI, and indeed, it is a new thing and wonderful, but I do worry that it will be increasing the dark matter of research production. I have been told, unless it's just institutional pride, that Stanford, my institution, has the highest computational capacity than any other university worldwide. I'm very, very proud of it. Still, Stanford's computational capacity is only 1% of the computational capacity of companies like Alphabet, Meta, Microsoft, or Apple. Most AI research may grow outside the published scientific literature. There's no reason why companies like these would want to publish everything to make a career as a tenured professor. It may or may not be open source, and in fact, even those parts that are open source may be more like enticements and temptations for academic and independent researchers to join the platforms and share everything with these absorbing AI tools that then become part of what the company owns. You have all seen probably the fascinating work that Brian Nosek and a very large team of investigators put together in investigating the reproducibility of cancer biology. What was the key lesson, at least from my perspective? One might say, well, 60 to 80% of these highly cited papers could not be reproduced. Yes, that's one lesson. To me, the most important lesson was that the vast majority of the experiments that this team tried to reproduce could not even get started. Why? Well, despite communication with the investigators, despite trying to get additional insights and clarifications, the information was not there. Another major lesson was that it took 197 weeks on average from designing the experiment to finishing and writing up the results and publishing. So these are old experiments. You can think of the average PhD student who goes to the lab and the mentor says, well, why don't you get your hands wet trying to reproduce that paper from Nature? And then they need, on average, 197 weeks to try to reproduce that paper. And actually, 2/3 of the time, not being able to reproduce it, even if they do get the experiment started. That's really demoralizing. Many people are not happy to hear about reproducibility concerns. We all want to defend our reputation. We want to defend that we are correct, we are right, our research is solid. Well, personally, I would be okay if my research is wrong because my reputation depends on showing that most research is false. So if my research is false, then my reputation becomes stronger. But for most people, this is not the case. So we get into reproducibility wars, and I think we need to move beyond emotion and animosity and say that within a community of well-intended scientists is very likely, very often, to get it wrong. We have to watch out for the non-well-intended situations and also the artificial situations that may be made sense. So resistance to refutation has been demonstrated repeatedly across very different fields in medicine, in epidemiology, in psychology. Papers that get squarely refuted continue to be heavily cited. Papers that get retracted continue to be heavily cited. Many solutions have been proposed, and many of them seem to have worked in improving reproducibility in specific fields. Teamwork, adoption of replication culture, registration, sharing, improving sharing, reproducibility checks, containment of conflicted sponsors and authors, more appropriate statistics, standardizing definitions and analysis, more stringent thresholds for claiming discoveries or successes, improvements of study design standards, improvements in peer review and reporting, dissemination of research, better training of all of us, the scientific workforce, in methods and statistical literacy. It looks like a very long wish list, and it's very difficult to implement all of that. But some of them have been implemented pretty successfully in several scientific fields. I think sharing remains at the epicenter of interest because it is really important. Unless we can share, we cannot really put much trust on what we read, and we cannot repeat analysis, we cannot use these data, we cannot integrate these data with other data sets. Why is it not possible to share? We try to ask the authors of the most highly cited papers in several scientific fields like psychology and psychiatry. We recently published our data on social sciences along with Tom Hardwick and other colleagues from my team. A key reason was that not even the PI had control of the data. The data were outside of researchers' control. Very often, the principal investigator had never seen the data set that carried their name in the manuscript. Why? Well, because the arrangement that they had with the industry sponsor suggested that the industry sponsor will analyze the data, and then they never had a chance to see them. New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, and JAMA are among the journals that for a number of years now have followed the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors' recommendation that routinely we should have a data sharing statement in the publication of clinical trials. We looked at what is shown in these data sharing statements, and yes, these statements are there, but if you ask for individual level data to be shared, well, this is just about half. If you ask for a specific repository where these would be, these are pretty few, a small minority. If you ask for the identified individual level data in a specific plan, then this is less than 10%. If you want to get the data right now, there's only 2 out of 500 clinical trials worth. Supported by the industry. Many of them have industry authorship. Many of them have statistical analysis conducted by industry statisticians. Some of them, a small minority, are sharing the data. And these are the most highly cited, the most influential papers. Not much being shared. BMJ and PLOS Medicine have been among the journals that have been more aggressive. So for a number of years now, they asked for clinical trialists to promise that they will share their own data as a precondition for publication. And when, along with Florian Odette, we went back to these authors and we asked for their own data, 46% of them did send the data sets. We reanalyzed the data sets and we found pretty much the same results with very small deviations that could be rounding errors. So in an environment of trust and sharing, we could achieve much higher rates of sharing. BMJ, as you might know, in the last couple of months has announced that that policy of making the raw data a prerequisite to publication has become applied more widely, not just to clinical trials. We will have to see whether that would lead to even greater sharing. More sharing is happening. This is an observatory that we have built across biomedicine, and this is a trajectory of the sharing rates for data. 20%, well, it used to be 0% 25 years ago. Looking across the entire PubMed open access in text mining mode with algorithms of R transparent, we see that that rate has stabilized at about 20% in the last 5 years. About 5% of biomedical papers share their code. A little bit more have a protocol. Most of them claim that they're novel with not much change. A few more than it used to be are admitting that they have a replication that they present. Everybody has a placeholder, or almost everyone, on conflicts of interest and funding, but we don't know if the information reported is complete. Fields of science that share data are not necessarily the ones that have protocols. Fields that share code are not necessarily the ones that have protocols. Fields that share code, most of those would share data, but not necessarily. If you ask for sharing of data, code, and protocol registration, very, very rarely would you see that. With more complex research, the challenges are becoming greater. Many years ago, we published these recommendations in Science about ways to enhance computational reproducibility. There's a trade-off between transparency and complexity. A linear regression can be presented very nicely with just the coefficients of the variables and the constant. If you have deep neural networks, you need far more detail in order to be sufficiently transparent to be reproducible. But this can be done. This is, for example, a paper that we published in Nature where we list the options, the software, the tools that are available so that any extremely complex artificial intelligence paper can be completely transparent and hopefully reproducible. Large language models are adding yet another layer of challenges. And I think that we should be both enthusiastic and skeptical at the same time. Most people feel that these models are amazing. In my experience, most of the time, their performance is very poor in applications that would really matter. They have great potential for misinformation. They can produce misinformation in massive scale. They can make inequalities worse. They can affect our society in ways that we have not yet imagined. They can have unknown impact on the scientific workforce. For example, believe me, I'm not an AI tool, I'm real, but maybe your next keynote speaker may be an AI tool. And of course there's lots of ethical issues, and there's wonderful presentations in this conference about the ethics of AI and broader issues that we're still struggling to understand. For those who want to delve more into peer-reviewed scientific publication, I'm one of the directors of the International Congress on Peer Review and Scientific Publication, which is happening next September in Chicago. Metrics, along with BMJ and JAMA, are sponsoring it, and I invite you all to be there so that we can all learn from each other. Maybe we need to think beyond the scientific literature. Maybe we need to strengthen our post-publication critique. For example, someone can pick that an I is missing in critique here. Not much of that is happening, unfortunately. When we looked across the 10 most cited journals across each scientific field, most of them had very limited options for post-publication critique. Many of them had even weird restrictions, like you need to write your critique within 150 words, and then the copy editor will cut it back to 115, and you will fight to get it back to 122. But others allow critique only within 4 weeks or 6 weeks from publication. So you need to watch very carefully and not miss the timeline, otherwise the paper is cut in stone and cannot be modified.
5 minutes, John.
Very few papers do get critique, and I think that we need to try to understand why don't we get more meaningful critique, because of course we can get lots of meaningless critique and lots of critique that does not really contribute to the progress of science. My last comments would be about re-engineering the reward system of science. We need that if we want to change how science is being done. We pay a lot of attention to productivity, and I have nothing against productivity. I love writing papers. Probably I'm a bit maniac about this. If you tell me don't write papers, I will get depressed. Suicidal, who knows? But we need to also pay attention to quality, reproducibility, sharing, and translation. And all of these can be measured to some extent. Of course, nothing is perfect in our measurements, but if we do want to look at the whole acronym, the electrocardiogram, PQRST, we can really get into our evaluations all these different dimensions. We can use these dimensions along with other dimensions of reliable and responsive and societally appropriate metrics in hiring, promotion, and tenure decisions. This is not happening at the moment when we look at textbooks and handbooks of faculty and promotion or hiring or tenure. But handbooks tend to be outdated, I believe, when it comes to evaluations of scientists in actual committees that appraise someone's work. I have seen that happening far more frequently. To conclude, the discussion surrounding reproducibility and how to improve it has been very intense. Reproducibility indicators are surrogates. They're not the end product. We want better science. We want better research. We want a positive impact. This is far more complex. If we improve some indicators, but we don't get that, then we have not made much progress. There are many new stakeholders and new ways of publishing science, and these may change fundamental notions about what the scientific record is and what it looks like. Finally, progress on reproducibility is in the eye of the beholder. Even the beholder sometimes may be more pessimistic or more optimistic. I have my good days and my bad days. I hope I do not completely lead you to major depression. Thank you very much.